Hello, I'm Dick Campbell. Welcome to another one of my Great Moments in History presentations. For many years, I've been a student of history, and with this interest, I have created a variety of 8 history talks about subjects of interest to me, which I've presented many times since 1999 to local Oshkosh community groups and many other organizations throughout Wisconsin, and even up in Fairbanks, Alaska. And now, I'd like to share one of these moments with you entitled, Remembering the Battle of Midway. It has been called the greatest naval battle since Trafalgar, which incidentally took place 209 years ago on October 1805 between the British Royal Navy and the combined fleets of the French and Spanish navies, resulting in a British victory led by Admiral Horatio Nelson. On June 4, 1942, near Midway Islands, located 1,300 miles west of Hawaii, the course of the Pacific War changed dramatically. Before the Battle of Midway, the forces of Imperial Japan seemed unstoppable. After Midway, the Japanese would never again take the offensive. The surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor at 7:55 Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, seriously damaged 8 U.S. battleships, sinking 4, including the Arizona, which was moored on Battleship Row. Incidentally, this newspaper picture is copied from one of my 8 World War II scrapbooks, which I compiled from 1941 to 1945, when I was 9 to 13 years old. Today, the submerged Arizona is the centerpiece of the Pearl Harbor War Memorial. If you look closely, you can make out the ghostly shape of the sunken battleship beneath the memorial and a shimmering trail of oil that some say is the tears of the 1,177 crewmen who died here. All but 229 whose bodies were recovered in the days after the attack remain entombed in the ship. Like a bridge spanning the years, the Arizona Memorial has become a place of reconciliation as well as remembrance. As stunning as it was for the United States, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was more a psychological setback than a military defeat. Although 21 ships were sunk or damaged by a stroke of luck, all of the U.S. Pacific's fleet of 3 aircraft carriers were at sea on December 7. The U.S. Navy had 7 large aircraft carriers at the outbreak of World War II to defend both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. They were the Enterprise, the Hornet, the Lexington, the Ranger, the Saratoga, the Wasp, and the Yorktown. All of these 7 pictures are also copies from my World War II scrapbooks. Incidentally, Japan had 10 aircraft carriers before the war, similar to this one pictured from one of my scrapbooks, but lost 2 before the Battle of Midway, reducing their number to 8. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy swept decisively east and south across the Pacific, as shown on this map. As early as December 31, 1941, the psychological tide began to turn when Admiral Chester Nimitz took over as the U.S. commander in the Pacific. Under Nimitz's leadership, the badly outmatched Pacific Fleet made the most of its scarce resources, harassing the Japanese and slowing their advance. The two adversaries did not meet head-to-head until the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942, when the American and Japanese aircraft carriers squared off in the first ever naval engagement, fought entirely by carrier aircraft, as the opposing ships never saw each other. The American Coral Sea victory prevented the invasion of Port Moresby, New Guinea, while also proving that they could stand up to the best of the Japanese Navy. Had the Japanese invasion troops gotten through to Port Moresby, they would have almost certainly continued on to Australia. And so the stage was set for Midway. The Battle of Midway was one of the most important naval battles of World War II. The U.S. Navy decisively defeated the Japanese attack on Midway Island, inflicting irreparable damage on their naval fleet. Military historian John Keegan called it, quote, the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare, unquote. It was Japan's worst naval defeat in 350 years. The Japanese plan was to lure the U.S. aircraft carriers into a trap. Japan intended to occupy Midway, shown here in red, as part of an overall plan to extend their defensive perimeter. This operation was also considered preparatory for further attacks against Fiji, Samoa, and Hawaii itself. The plan was handicapped by faulty Japanese assumptions of American reaction. Most significantly, American code breakers were able to determine the date and location of the attack, enabling the forewarned U.S. Navy to set up an ambush of its own. What was the background that led to this strategic battle in World War II? Following their attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had attained its strategic goals quickly, taking the Philippines, Malaya, Sumatra, and the Dutch East Indies, the latter, with its vital oil, tin, and rubber resources, was particularly important to Japan. Japan's naval leader, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's primary strategic goal was the elimination of the American carrier forces, which he perceived as the principal threat to the overall Pacific campaign. This concern was acutely heightened by the Doolittle Raid on April 18, 1942, which involved 16 U.S. Army Air Force B-25 Mitchell bombers, shown here on the deck of the U.S. aircraft carrier Hornet, just prior to takeoff. 80 crew members were on board these 16 aircraft. They were launched from the Hornet and bombed targets in Tokyo and other Japanese cities. This raid, while militarily insignificant, was a severe psychological shock to the Japanese and showed the existence of a gap in their defenses around the Japanese home islands to American bombers. Incidentally, after the raid, of the 15 B-25s that made it to China, 11 were abandoned in flight, their crews bailing out, and 4 crash-landed or ditched off the Chinese coast. 2 flyers died in crash landings, and 1 was killed bailing out. 8 more were captured by the Japanese. 1 aircraft crew made it to Russia. Of the 80 Doolittle Raiders, 62 survived the war. This and other successful hit-and-run raids by American carriers showed that they were still a threat, although seemingly reluctant to be drawn into an all-out battle. Yamamoto reasoned that another attack on the main U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor would induce all of the American fleet to sail out to fight, including the carriers. However, given the strength of the American land-based air power in Hawaii, he judged that it was too risky to attack Pearl Harbor again directly. Instead, Yamamoto selected Midway, a tiny atoll at the extreme northwest end of the Hawaiian island chain. Midway was not especially important in the larger scheme of Japan's intentions, but the Japanese felt the Americans would consider Midway a vital outpost of Pearl Harbor and would therefore be compelled to defend it vigorously. The U.S. did consider Midway vital because after the battle, establishment of a U.S. submarine base on Midway allowed submarines operating from Pearl Harbor to refuel and reprovision, extending their radius of operations by 1,200 miles. In addition to serving as a seaplane base, Midway's airstrips also served as a forward staging point for bomber attacks on Wake Island. So, what was Yamamoto's battle plan of action? Yamamoto's belief that the Americans had been demoralized by their frequent defeats in the preceding 6 months felt deception would be required to lure the U.S. fleet into a fatally compromised situation. And to this end, he dispersed his invasion forces so that their full extent would be unlikely to be discovered by the Americans prior to the battle. Critically, Yamamoto's supporting 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers would surround Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier striking force, which consisted of 4 large aircraft carriers: the Akagi, the Hairu, the Kaga, and the Soryu, in softening up Midway for invasion. Incidentally, all of these carriers participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. At the same time, a 2-carrier Japanese task force would raid the Aleutian Islands of Kiska and Attu, which stretch westward from Alaska, hoping to possibly decoy Nimitz into moving north. However, the Japanese operations in the Aleutian Island removed yet more of their ships that could otherwise have augmented their forcing strike at Midway. Japan's heavy surface forces were intended to destroy whatever part of the U.S. fleet might come to Midway's relief, once Nagumo's carriers had weakened them sufficiently for a daylight gun duel. This was typical of the battle doctrine of most major navies at that time. A word about breaking the Japanese code that I mentioned earlier. Unknown to Yamamoto, he lost the advantage of surprise even before his ships left their bases in late May. With persistence and skill, U.S. naval intelligence, located in a basement room pictured here in Pearl Harbor, not only analyzed Japanese radio traffic, but even managed to crack some of Yamamoto's naval codes. As a result, U.S. intelligence worked out the size and makeup of the various enemy forces and decided that something very big was about to happen in the Midway area. Japanese radio traffic referred to the target area simply as AF. By May 8, intelligence officer Joseph Rochfort knew that a major enemy operation, whose objectives was sometimes called AF, was in the offing, and that it would take place somewhere in the Central Pacific. Several days later, he was sure the target was Midway. His superiors in Washington weren't convinced. So Rochfort devised a test that would flush out the location of. The radio station in Midway dispatched an uncoded message, falsely reporting that the water distillation plant on the island had broken down, causing a severe water shortage. Within 48 hours, intelligence decrypted a Japanese radio transmission alerting their commanders that AF was short of water. And by May 27, Rochfort had built up such a detailed picture of their plans that he was able to predict almost precisely when and where the enemy striking force would appear. As a result, the Americans entered the battle with a very good picture of where, when, and in what strength the Japanese would appear. Nimitz knew that the Japanese had negated their numerical advantage by dividing their ships into 4 separate task groups, as shown on this map, all too widely separated to be able to support each other. Nimitz calculated that the aircraft on his 3 carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, plus those aircraft on Midway Island Air Base, gave the United States rough parity with Yamamoto's 4 carriers, mainly because American carrier groups were larger than Japanese ones. The Japanese, by contrast, remained almost totally unaware of their opponent's true strength and dispositions even after the battle began. The Yorktown and her escorts of 2 cruisers and 5 destroyers moved out of Pearl Harbor on May 30. It made up Task Force 17. This task force was under the command of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Waiting 350 miles northeast of Midway was Task Force 16, made up of the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, and 6 cruisers, 9 destroyers, which had departed Pearl Harbor on May 28. This task force was under the command of Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Together, these ships of Task Force 16 and 17 formed the striking heart of a sizable American force, the greatest yet assembled in the first year of the war in the Pacific. On June 2nd, they all arrived at the appointed rendezvous spot, 390 miles northeast of Midway, to await the enemy. Nimitz knew what sort of a gamble he was taking. If he lost his 3 carriers and their planes, there was nothing to take their place. No wonder he had nicknamed the rendezvous point Luck. Nimitz also understood that luck, as well as skill, would be needed for any hope of a victory in the battle to come. They planned to lie well north of Midway and rely on search planes from the island to spot the Japanese. Then they would move in fast and launch a heavy airstrike at Yamamoto's carriers. The carriers were the key, as without air cover they provided, the rest of the Japanese fleet would be wide open to attack from the sky. At dawn on June 3, 1942, the stage was set for the Battle of Midway. Far to the north, 2 Japanese carriers ready to strike at American bases in the Aleutians. The Japanese invasion force of Midway was some 700 miles due west of Midway. Angling in from the northwest was Nagumo's carrier striking force. About 300 miles astern of Nagumo were the heavy guns of Yamamoto's force. Unknown to the enemy, the 3 U.S. carriers were circling patiently northeast of Midway. And as one historian of the battle put it, quote, "The hunter had become the hunted," unquote. June 3 was a day of tension and alarms. At dawn, Japanese planes bombed the Aleutian Islands at Dutch Harbor, paving the way for Japanese troops to land on 2 small islands, Kiska and Attu, at the very tip of the Aleutian chain. In mid-morning, an American PBY Catalina flying boat from Midway Island spotted a group of ships west of the island. Admiral Fletcher correctly decided this must be the Japanese invasion force, which he knew would mark time until American opposition had been eliminated. He saved his precious advantage of surprise for bigger game. Nagumo's 4 carriers rushed through the evening darkness of June 3 toward Midway. Fletcher and Spruance were also on the move that night, aiming for a dawn position that would put them within striking distance of the enemy carriers. June 4 was clearly going to be the day of battle, and a good deal would depend on which side made the first sighting. At 0430 on June 4, Nagumo launched 108 aircraft from his carriers, consisting of 36 dive bombers, 36 torpedo bombers, and 36 fighters, for his initial attack on Midway Island itself. Nagumo also ordered his escort ship to catapult a scouting force of 7 seaplanes for a precautionary search to the north. As Nagumo's aircraft were taking off, American PBYs were again leaving Midway Island to run their search patterns. At 0530, the American PBY scout planes reported sighting 2 Japanese carriers, the Kaga and Akagi, with empty decks, indicating an airstrike was probably en route to Midway, having taken off prior to the Japanese attack. The American bombers based on Midway Island made several unsuccessful attacks on the Japanese carrier fleet. At 0620, Japanese carrier aircraft bombed and heavily damaged the base at Midway. The initial Japanese attack did not succeed in neutralizing Midway. American bombers could still use the air base to refuel and attack the Japanese invasion force, and most of Midway's land-based defenses were intact. Another Japanese aerial attack to soften Midway's defenses would be necessary if troops were to go ashore by June 7. Nagumo had kept half of his aircraft in reserve. At 0715, as a result of the attacks from Midway, along with the morning flight leader's recommendation of a second strike, Nagumo ordered his reserve planes to be sent below to his carrier's hangar decks to have their torpedoes replaced by heavy bombs, more suited to land targets on Midway Island. At that moment, some 200 miles away, Admiral Spruance also had to make an agonizing decision. If he launched immediately, he stood a chance of catching the enemy carriers when they were most vulnerable. Refueling and rearming the planes returned from the Midway strike. But he also had to face the hard fact that many of his planes might not have enough fuel to make it back to their carriers. He decided to take the risk and hit with everything he had, and ordered off all the attack planes that could fly. While Nagumo's crewmen worked furiously at the backbreaking job of rearming the planes with bombs, a series of very disturbing messages began to come in from one of his scouting seaplanes launched earlier. Its pilot first reported that he had sighted what appeared to be 10 enemy surface ships. While waiting impatiently for more information, Nagumo ordered work on the torpedo bombers to stop. It was now 0800, and once more he was distracted by American attackers from Midway Island. 16 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, flown by inexperienced Marine pilots, glided in to attack the Japanese carriers and were shot to pieces by Japanese Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. A few moments later, large geysers of water erupted around the Japanese carriers as Army B-17 bombers from Midway tried to hit the twisting ships from almost 4 miles up. Like the dive bombers, they scored no hits. As the surviving American planes disappeared in the distance, Nagumo, aboard the Akagi, faced a second critical decision. The seaplane search plane had finally reported that the enemy is accompanied by what appears to be an aircraft carrier. Just as Nagumo ordered his planes to be armed once again with torpedoes so that they could attack ships, his Midway strike force returned. Nagumo could either immediately launch these bombers of the reserve force still on the flight decks without fighter escorts against the American carrier that the search plane had sighted, or he could send them below, recover the Midway raiders, and later send off a strong, well-balanced force to hit the enemy. He chose the second option. The returning Japanese planes began landing shortly after 0830, and crewmen set to work at a frantic pace. The flight deck had to be cleared, the returning planes refueled and rearmed, and a new strike force respotted for takeoff. When the last plane was aboard, Nagumo turned away from Midway and began steaming at top speed toward the point where the U.S. ships had been sighted. Nagumo began to feel somewhat easier. Midway had been heavily damaged. Every enemy attack on his ships had been beaten off, and the Americans apparently had one carrier to oppose his 4. He hoped the change of course would throw off any more assaults for the hour that he needed to prepare his airstrike. At the time that Nagumo made his course change, 151 U.S. carrier planes were winging across the Pacific. Admiral Spruance had practically emptied the Hornet and the Enterprise, keeping back only enough fighters for a combat air patrol over the 2 carriers. The first to sight the Japanese carriers was Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, pictured here with Ensign George Gay circled. Flying low without fighter cover at 0920, the 15 TBD Devastators were pounced on by Japanese Zero fighters. One after another, the lumbering TBDs were torn apart or set ablaze. Every one of Torpedo Squadron 8's planes was shot down. Only one man from this squadron, George Gay, survived. On his final flight, he was preparing to drop his torpedo when he was hit by enemy fire. He almost lost control of his plane and wasn't sure if his torpedo was released. He was now screaming toward the Japanese carrier through a storm of flak and fighter aircraft with no real option but to fly right over the enemy carrier. He flew along a flight deck crowded with planes and men flying as low as possible. His plane crashed into the sea. After opening the cockpit hood, Gay crawled out of the sinking plane, inflated his life jacket, and hid under a seat cushion to watch the battle from a ringside seat in the ocean. He was picked up by an American ship 30 hours later. A few minutes later, the Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 TBD planes bored in to attack. The Zero fighters swarmed in for the kill and shot down 11 of the 14 TBD Devastators. At 10:00, it was the turn of the Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 TBDs. 9 of them also went crashing into the sea. Of the 41 TBD Devastators from the 3 squadrons, 35 had been lost, and not a single one of their torpedoes found its mark. Of the total of 82 men in the 3 attacking Torpedo Squadron planes who'd flown off to the Japanese carriers that day, 69 had failed to return, an 84% loss ratio. No Japanese kamikaze pilot later in the war ever went to his death more open-eyed or with more certain foreknowledge than had these men. The TBD Devastator was never again used in combat. Throughout the attack, the Japanese crews were preparing planes for launching. At 10:20, the Japanese carriers Akagi, Hairu, Kaga, and Soryu turned into the wind, and Nagumo gave the long-awaited order to launch planes. Just then, at 10:22, some 15,000 feet up, pilots and gunners in 54 SBD Dauntless dive bombers were staring in amazement at the sight below. They could not understand why they had come this far without having Japanese fighters swarming around them. They hadn't seen a single fighter in the air, and not a shot had been fired at them. By almost miraculous coincidence, 2 dive bomber groups which had taken off from the Enterprise and the Yorktown almost 2 hours apart had arrived over the Japanese fleet at the same moment and were poised to attack just when all the enemy fighters were flying low and all the enemy carriers were in a state of maximum vulnerability. Almost simultaneously, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Akagi came under dive bomber attack. Only the Hairu, now well to the north, escaped their attention at that time. It appeared the first bomb hit the Kaga, striking the aft end of her crowded flight deck. The second bomb hit a fuel cart on the Kaga just forward of the island, engulfing the bridge in a firestorm of flaming gasoline. A third bomb landed amidships, by which time the carrier was doomed. The Soryu was the next victim, taking at least 3 hits in quick succession from the Yorktown squadron, and soon becoming a mass of flames. The Akagi now fell prey to the Enterprise attack planes. The first bomb went down the midships elevator and exploded on the hangar deck, where unstowed bombs and torpedoes stoked a huge inferno. The first bomb hit the Kaga at 10:22. The last bomb to find the Soryu struck no later than 10:28. Within this 6-minute span, all 3 of the Japanese carriers under attack were mortally damaged. All told, the attack cost 16 SBD American dive bombers. Despite the disaster that had overtaken him, Nagumo ordered his one remaining carrier, the Hairu, to continue the fight. Hairu's first attack wave, consisting of 18 dive bombers and 6 fighter escorts, took off and followed the retreating American aircraft back to their carriers and then attacked the Yorktown, hitting her with 3 bombs, which blew a hole in the deck, snuffed out her boilers, and destroyed several anti-aircraft turrets. Despite the damage, repair teams on the Yorktown were able to plank over the flight deck and restore power to several boilers within an hour, enabling her to resume air operations. Then a second wave of Hairu planes plunged in and 2 torpedoes ripped into the Yorktown's hull. The boiler rooms flooded and the Yorktown again lost power and came to a stop, this time at a 26-degree list to port. Fearing she was about to capsize, her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, pictured here, gave the order to abandon ship. Many of the Yorktown survivors were taken aboard the destroyer Benham, shown here, and other ships standing by. In all, 2,270 men were rescued out of the 2,300 on board the Yorktown. The listing Yorktown can be seen in the distance in this picture. Meanwhile, salvage efforts on the Yorktown were encouraging as she was still afloat and being towed toward Pearl Harbor. The destroyer Hayman was tied up alongside, pictured here, providing power for a repair crew. In the early afternoon of June 6, a Japanese submarine, the I-168, fired a salvo of torpedoes. 2 struck the Yorktown, causing only a few casualties since most of the crew had already been evacuated, but a third struck and sank the destroyer Hayman, which went down in 5 minutes. The last moments of the Hayman, shown here, were captured by a photographer who was part of the salvage party aboard the Yorktown. Many of the Hayman's crew who managed to escape the ship's sinking were killed or wounded in the water when her depth charges went off. Of the Hayman's 241 officers and crew, 81 died. But the Yorktown lingered on through the night. It wasn't until dawn on June 7 that the Yorktown's flight deck disappeared beneath a giant oil slick, not to be seen again for 56 years. Within hours, the Yorktown was avenged. A strike force from the Enterprise caught the Hairu preparing to launch her remaining bombers. Once more, the SBDs screamed down out of the sky, and once more the effect was lethal. 4 bombs slashed into the Japanese carrier, blowing the forward elevator completely out of the flight deck, splashing gasoline everywhere, and turning the ship into a funeral pyre. One by one, during the night and into the next day, the 4 carriers of the once proud Japanese carrier striking force disappeared into the depths of the Pacific Ocean. The final Japanese casualty of the Battle of Midway was the cruiser Mikuma, after her day-long battering by U.S. carrier planes. This is another copy of a picture from my 1942 World War II scrapbook. When the remaining Japanese ships withdrew from the battle, they had lost in the course of only a few days 4 carriers, 2 cruisers, 3 destroyers, 1 transport, 332 aircraft, and 3,057 men, which included many of their finest pilots. American losses included the carrier Yorktown and the destroyer Hayman, 144 aircraft and 362 men, including 104 carrier pilots and aircrew. So ended the Battle of Midway. It had been won and won brilliantly by U.S. carrier forces, and historians rank it as a major turning point of World War II. Its glorious success resulted not only from careful planning, but from individual initiative on the part of a few splendid leaders, superior intelligence, the effective use of radar, the heroic sacrifice of the torpedo planes, and a dazzling skill of many of the dive bomber pilots. The Japanese never fully recovered from the loss of their 4 big fleet aircraft carriers sunk at Midway. They simply did not have the industrial capacity to produce a score of new carriers in the midst of war. Even more critically, Japan never recovered from the loss of so many of her airplanes and trained carrier pilots. In hindsight, it is evident that the course of the war, and with it the course of history, had tilted on the fulcrum of the Battle of Midway. Finding the Yorktown. 56 years later, after the conclusion of the Battle of Midway, famed underwater explorer Robert Ballard embarked on a search for the lost ships that had sunk in that historic battle. Dr. Ballard's search area was enormous, and his targets, the Yorktown, the Hayman, and the 4 Japanese carriers, lay over 3 miles down, far deeper than the Titanic. The odds against finding even one of these ships looked at least as long as the odds against an American victory 56 years earlier. Ballard's base ship, the Laney Chusett, pictured here, was their home for their month-long search in May 1998. The Laney's dynamic positioning system allowed her to stay in one spot even in strong winds and currents. The primary piece of underwater equipment used in the search was the Advanced Tethered Vehicle, ATV, pictured here. The 15,000-pound unmanned submersible can plunge as deep as 20,000 feet on a tether containing control cables. A pilot on the deck of the Laney flies the ATV by using a joystick to operate thrusters that send it in any direction. He also controls video and still cameras mounted on the ATV. The search area, pictured here, included some underwater volcanoes. To cover this area, the Laney first sailed parallel lines on a northeast-southwest axis, and then sailed east-west to create detailed sonar pictures of the bottom. Equipment failures and time constraints kept working against Ballard, and it often seemed that he might return with nothing. But finally, on May 19, 1998, they located the remains of the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown. Given that it had spent 56 years on the bottom, the Yorktown state of preservation was surprising. Much of the ship is still recognizable, including the pilot house where the ship's binnacle is visible, and almost all of the wooden flight deck. The gun mounts and guns are in such good condition that some of the white rubber eyepieces on the 20mm gun sights are still there. And except where intense heat damaged it, the original paint still covers the ship. Ballard's subsequent search for the Hayman and the Japanese carriers was ultimately unsuccessful. Midway, actually 2 islands pictured here, back in 1998, looked quite different from the military base of 1942, when the airstrip was on the smallest eastern island. In 1998, airplanes landed only on the larger Sand Island, while Eastern was a wildlife refuge, its runways overgrown with vegetation. Midway had gone back to the birds, the Goonie birds to be precise, and that's what the servicemen called the albatrosses that breed on the atoll. Back in 1942, the birds had been pushed aside by men and flying machines. In 1998, there were so many albatrosses, roughly 800,000 nesting birds, on these tiny islands that it was only safe for airplanes to land and take off at night. At that time, Midway was home to 70% of the total world population of albatrosses. In closing, I'd like to share this quote from Robert Ballard. "To the brave U.S. flyers and sailors who sacrificed their lives and turned the tide of war in the Pacific during the historic Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942. Here's a list, if I may add, to some of the Battle of Midway resources that I used to put together this great moment in history. And of the 3 that are highlighted, I would recommend, if anyone has any further interest in reading more about this battle, 3 of them that I think are very valuable. The first here listed is The Return to Midway by Robert Ballard. And the next one is the book entitled Shattered Sword by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully. And the third one, The Battle of Midway by Greg Simons. And I thank you for your interest in this great moment in history. Thank you.